Fáilte roimh go léir cóide. You're very welcome to the annual Trinity Monday Memorial Discourse. And I think this is one of the really lovely, enjoyable, I suppose, many things that happen on Trinity Monday. So last year, for those of you who were here, you'll recall that we had a fantastic lecture from Ivana Bacic about Avril Deverell. And I think this year we're in for another fantastic lecture, John, but no pressure on you or anything like that. This year we're focusing on botany, and I think it's a really good topic for us to focus on, I suppose because of the huge interest in sustainability in this university. And it's because of that reason I think we're really, really delighted that the focus of the lecture this year is the life, career and times of A.F.G. Kerr, the celebrated botanist and physician. So all I'm going to do now is just introduce John Parnell as our speaker. John is a fellow emeritus and a professor in botany here. So I think everyone in this room knows John really well, and he is a hugely accomplished academic. He became a fellow in 1993 and was appointed to a personal chair in systematic botany in 2010. And John, for me, you're actually completely synonymous with things to do with biodiversity and botany in this university. And I suppose we were just talking about it earlier, long before all of us were very focused on things such as ecology and knew those kind of terms, you were forging ahead in everything that you did. John has given tremendous service to the university. He served as Dean of Graduate Studies. He was Head of School of Natural Sciences from 2008 to 2011. And he also was Senior Dean here from 2017 to 2021. And given that the day is in it, when we kind of look back at things past in this very historical day, I thought I might draw your attention to how the onerous duties of the senior dean were described in the college statutes of 1749. So they list the range of potential offences that the early deans had to consider, including perjury, notorious theft, willful manslaughter, fornication, adultery, incest, or violently striking a fellow or scholar, by which they're severely wounded. I was glad to know, though, that the deans had to take account of even slightly striking the provost, or actually, you'll be glad to know, vice provost, dean, chief lecturer, a doctor or bachelor in divinity, or shall on purpose spoil the locks of the gates, or by stealth open the gates of the college, or shall promote conspiracies or snares against the college. So I think it's really interesting. John, I have to say, did a great job of protecting us from all of that when he was senior dean and much more. But while I say that in jest, I think it speaks to the fact that John Parnell has always been hugely committed to Trinity through his scholarly work, through the way he used to teach, and through all that he did beyond that for the university. So I can think of no greater person to give the talk this year than John, so I was really, really delighted when he said he would do it. Not alone did he do those things, John has also been chair of the Grounds and Gardens Committee, curator of the Herbarium. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's just an amazing place, and director of the Botanic Garden. So, you know, John, from everything that he has done here in his work and study, is, I think, a very brilliant person to give us the kind of insights that I think will be really valuable on the life of A.F.G. Kerr. So, it's my honour to invite John to deliver the 2023 Trinity Monday Memorial Discourse on Dr. Alfred Francis George Kerr, botanist and physician, a life well lived. So John, over to you, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Provost, for that overwhelming introduction. I hope I can follow it up well. I suppose I'd like to start by saying four things before I start into the discourse. The first is to ask you to turn off or turn down or do something to your mobile phones so that they don't go off during this discourse. The second thing is to thank Claire and the Provost's office for her efforts in trying to make this space as visually attractive as possible. In other words, making the projection facilities as good as they possibly can be. And I would secondly, therefore, urge you to come to a position in the room where you can see the screens. And the reason for that is that this is going to be an unconventional discourse. I know, having been here for 40 years, that it's normal for the presenter to read from a script to you. But in my 40 years plus of giving presentations to various audiences, I have never, ever read from a script. And I'm sorry, this retired and old dog is not going to learn new tricks at his time of life. So what I am going to do is to use the slides as hanging points around which to frame my discourse. So, as the Provost has said, we're going to be talking today about a medical graduate of Trinity College, Arthur Francis George Kerr, who went to Thailand and became known as the father of Thai botany. Now, that's not my phrase, it's a phrase that's used by Thai botanists, and actually it was a phrase that was used by the former ambassador of Ireland to Thailand. The structure of the discourse revolves around three distinct headings. First, I'm going to tell you something about his early life. Secondly, I'm going to say something about his legacy under three subheadings: herbarium specimens, photographs and diaries, and a very brief comment on his maps. And I'm going to close by saying something about his later life. So, firstly, his early life. Well, his parents were Elias William Kerr and Fanny Brady. They were married in County Donegal on the 3rd of February 1875. And as you can see, I hope, from their marriage certificate, Elias William Kerr was resident at the time in Kinloch in County Leitrim, and his profession is given as medical. He was a doctor, and he was also a graduate of Trinity College as well, and he wanted his children to follow on from him, not necessarily as doctors, but in entering Trinity College. Pretty much immediately after they were married, Fanny and Elias moved south. They moved to Kinloch in County Leitrim. Now, if your geography is as bad as mine, this map may be of help to you. And at this point, and occasionally throughout the discourse, I'm going to break to give you some ancillary information relevant to Kerr's life. At this point, I want to say a little bit more about Kinloch and its place in Kerr's life. I'm not the first person to work on the life of A.F.G. Kerr. I became interested in him because of his botanical connections, and others have too. In 1962, there was a paper published by Jacobs, who was a botanist working in Leiden, and it's something like 65 pages long. He also had access to Kerr's surviving children at that time, and so I thought when I started to work on Kerr that there'd be very little new to find out about him, and how wrong I was. Kerr is kind of the gift that keeps on giving. Every time I look at something to do with Kerr, there's something new to find out. It's also true to say that there are what one would call infelicities, I think, in Jacobs's paper, and we're going to deal with the first one now. The circle encloses Kinloch, a rather small village, and it is there that Jacobs suggests on the 7th of February 1877 that Kerr was born, the second child in the family and the first of 6 brothers in total. But imagine my surprise then when I found his birth certificate and found that he wasn't born then or there. He was born on the 27th of February 1877, and he was born slightly to the northeast of Kinloch in Edenvella. Now you could say, okay, well, it's very small errors, a few days, slight change of geography, but actually there are a number of these small errors throughout Jacobs's otherwise excellent paper. I'm not trying to decry Jacobs, that would be utterly wrong. It's a wonderful paper, I use it all the time, but there are some small infelicities in it. Very soon after Kerr was born in Edenvella on the 27th of February, they moved east to Mullinalek, where he was baptized. And it's clear that the family were not particularly well off and also were quite mobile, because almost instantly after that, they moved again. This time they moved overseas to England. Kerr went to school in Dorchester Grammar School, the family having moved to Dorset. And he obviously did relatively well there because he was able to enter college at a young age. He entered Trinity College, as the matriculation records show, in 1894. Now, I know you can't read this. I couldn't read it, which is why I've expanded it. His matriculation is dated 18th of October, 1894. He is shown as being a pensioner. That's the class of student that he was. He's shown as being a member of the Church of Ireland and a Protestant. I'm not quite sure why they needed to say both things in this entry, but they did. His father, Elias William Kerr, is given as a doctor of medicine, living in Dorchester, and Kerr's age is given as 17. Now, he's not the youngest person to matriculate in Trinity in 1894. If you look up and down the fourth column from the right on the screen, you can see that there are some people who are as young as 15. There's one aged 15, but there's also somebody there aged 27. So the age of matriculation was quite varied. The next incident in Kerr's life is about a week later, because he appears in the medical and dental students' records of the time, registering for a medical degree. Now, I'm going to break at that point just to tell you something. Maybe you know about it, but anyway, I'm going to do it, about the medical degree at that time. The statutory length of the medical degree had changed when Kerr went into his course. This followed on from a GMC, a General Medical Council report of 1890. And it didn't go well with Trinity College Dublin. Just to quote from the Lancet of 1891, and I give this for those of you who have acted as senior lecturer or Duttle or trying to change the curriculum. The Lancet of 1891 says that the 5-year curriculum proposal, inverted commas now, stank, particularly in the nostrils of the authorities of Dublin University, because of the extraordinary proposal to spend 6 months of the last year in learning medicine from a practitioner who had forgotten all he knew 40 or 50 years before. Maybe they had something in that. The point, though, is that Kerr matriculated in 1894 and therefore could have been expected to graduate sometime about 1899 or 1900. But that's not the case, as we'll see in a second. He certainly did graduate. He graduated with his BA Mod in 1897. There he is at the top of the list of those studying natural sciences. He graduated as senior moderator, a term probably unfamiliar to many of you, but that basically means that he did really well, and he got a first, and because he was at the head of the class, he got a gold medal too. So he was a very, very bright student, and you might therefore expect the next slide that I show you to reflect his graduation as a medical doctor, but no. The next slide that I show you is of this clipper ship, the SS Hesperus. And a few months ago, I and a colleague in Kew discovered that Kerr was a passenger on this ship in January 1899. He wasn't studying medicine at all. He'd taken this ship, which was famed, apparently, for fast passages between London, where it set off from, and Melbourne. Now, by fast passages, we're talking somewhere in the region of 70 days. So it wasn't a particularly swift crossing. And obviously, I wondered why on earth he'd done this. I mean, what caused him to break his education at this point? And I think there are maybe three potential reasons, none of them adequate in themselves, but probably cumulatively adding together. The first is apparently at that time, I'm informed by the Royal College of Physicians, that it was common enough for students to break their period of study because they had to pay fees, and if they couldn't, they had to earn money to pay those fees. Now, that doesn't seem a very likely cause for Kerr's trip on this ship, because if you think about it, he either spent 140 days or 150 days, if he took the same type of ship back, in transit as a student not earning any money, or perhaps if he got a slightly faster ship, he spent maybe about 120 days in travel. So earning money doesn't seem to be probably the primary reason for him taking this ship. It may be, and here I quote from a paper by Youngson, talking about medical education in general in Ireland, not specifically Trinity College. He says, Youngson, that professional teaching was often dull, and many lectures were not worth hearing. So perhaps Kerr just hated what he was doing. I mean, maybe he just got bored. I think, though, there's probably a third reason, and that is that he liked to travel. That comes across once you've studied other aspects of his life. He really liked to move about the place. He obviously did come back to Ireland. I don't know when. We haven't been able to trace his return voyage because he graduated as a BAO, BCH, and MB, a doctor, in other words, in 1901, in the spring of 1901. The commencements then were held in February. In March, he was abroad. He was studying or working with his father as assistant to his father's practice in England. So he moved very fast, having got his degree, to another country. And then he moved again very rapidly. And I think it's at this point that I want to introduce this person to you. Some of you will know him. This is Henry Horatio Dixon. He is, as you can see from this slide, a Fellow of the Royal Society in London. The building that you see to the right, the two-story building, was built entirely to house only Henry Dixon and his assistant. Nobody else, just him and his assistant. And that's because he was the most famous of the scientists, probably, apart from maybe John Joly, in Trinity at the time. The college was prepared to invest in him in a really big way because he was so well known. Why was he well known? Well, he was well known because he explained how water traveled from the soil to the tops of the tallest trees. His explanation was remarkable, combining physical and botanical sciences together in a novel way, and still stands today. But he was a very, very eminent scientist, and so my surprise was acute when I found a letter from Dixon to Kerr in the herbarium's archives. Now, it's dated a bit later than the period we're talking about at the moment, but it's relevant because it says, "This is just a line to wish you good luck in the coming year, 1926. Mrs. Dixon joins me in this wish, and the boys send their kind remembrances." He closes, "At any time, we would love to put you up. Our spare room is very rarely occupied. It would be a great pleasure to all of us if you came." Now, I think that's quite an astonishing letter to come from one of the most senior scientists to essentially a former student, and suggests both a very nice aspect to Dixon's personality, but also the sheer ability of Kerr that Dixon had recognized. Dixon was, in fact, probably responsible for getting Kerr his job overseas in Thailand. Now, 50% of Irish medical graduates of the time emigrated, approximately, but Kerr appears unique in going to Thailand. And I'm just going to break again to tell you something. Forgive me if you've been there and know all about it, about Thailand, but I think it might be useful. Thailand's a large country. It's about the size of France, metropolitan France, that is. And it's got a huge population. It's about 70 million. The vegetation of Thailand currently consists of about 30% forest. And to those of you who have been there, or those of you who have watched any of the travel programs, you know how popular a country it is from the tourist point of view nowadays, and how well connected it is. Now, when Kerr went there, that was not the case at all. Firstly, the political boundaries were slightly enlarged. Thailand has shrunk slightly from then. Secondly, the population was only about 7 million rather than 70. Thirdly, the country was covered in forest, about 97% forest. Fourthly, the infrastructure was extremely poor. There was no road development in Thailand before 1932 outside of Bangkok, and no railways either. So the trip of 700 kilometers between Bangkok and Chiang Mai took something like 44 days because you had to travel by river. So we're talking about a country which was very different to the one that we currently know about and love. When he went to Thailand initially, he worked as assistant to the British legation physician Hugh Campbell-Hyatt. And it's quite apparent that he encountered things when he was there which perhaps he'd never, you hope actually, he'd never encountered in either Dorset or Dublin. Just to quote to you from this letter is actually good in terms of the writing quality. Kerr's got amongst the worst writing that I have ever encountered, and that includes all of the students I've ever marked and my own, which is diabolical, as Marcella sitting there will tell you. It's almost unreadable in parts, but I'm just going to read it to you because I think it is unreadable. On the 6th of July 1901, he says, "Yesterday evening, Nai Shai was attacked by a drunken man with a sword at 6 p.m. The police were notified at midnight, and patient was got to the police hospital at 2:30 a.m. this morning. He then had the following injuries," and he goes on. That's just the first one that I've listed there, and I'll read the first one only. "A cut about 6 inches long horizontally across the middle of the front of the sternum, about the level of the manubrio-gladiolar junction. Air was bubbling in and out of the wound at every respiration, not frothed up with blood." Now, he doesn't actually say whether this gentleman survived this incident or not, but he records it in enormous detail, and that's one of the features of Kerr's diaries. They are very detailed indeed. He also, at the same time, was teaching himself to draw. This is another poor gentleman who was a mill hand in the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation's mill in Bangkok. They traded in timber, apart from anything else. They're still existing. They still exist, I think, as a company. And you can see that he's illustrated this poor gentleman's injured hand, and quite well, too. So he was obviously a dedicated physician working to Hugh Campbell-Hyatt. He, in fact, developed a closer relationship with the Hugh Campbell-Hyatts than just simply being assistant physician, because on his voyage out to Bangkok from London, he had encountered Daisy, who was the sister of Hugh Campbell-Hyatt's wife, and he married her. And in 1903, he went to Chiang Mai along with his new wife. Now, just to give you a wee flavor of what Chiang Mai was like at that time, many of you, I don't know how many, have probably been there. It's a tourist destination. But when he went there, there was no electricity, no gas, no piped water, no indoor sanitation, and therefore cooking was essentially done on wood, and lighting would be by candles, paraffin light, or perhaps through carbide lights, something like that. So it was infrastructure light, I think, would be one way of putting it. When he was there, obviously he was actually not the only doctor who was there, but he was obviously taken with his medical practice and paid to be a physician. But he expanded from that by becoming very interested in the plants that grew around Chiang Mai, which even now today is surrounded by mountains covered in really very interesting and some quite rare species. He became very interested in orchids. This belongs to the same genus as amongst his first orchid collections in the genus Oberonia. And he not only collected these materials, but he also dissected them, drew them, and sent them to Dixon in Trinity, where they form part of the Trinity College Botanic Gardens collection. And Trinity, in its old botanic gardens, ended up with one of the largest collections of orchids in the world, larger than Kew, with maybe at least 200 species. He also trained himself as a photographer. And this is one of his slides, and we'll be seeing quite a few of the others. This is in the Gulf of Thailand. Shows, I think, it's very nicely composed for a start. And it shows a typical local boat, a steamer in the background, and floating on the surface of the water, that plant, which is a pestilential introduced weed, Iconia crassipes, which is water hyacinths. He also photographed other things. It's among my favorite photographs of his. This is a typical street scene in Bangkok at the time. Very redolent of the period, I think. He also then was working as a medical doctor, and therefore he came back to Ireland to graduate in 1908 with his MD. He also, at the same time, got a diploma in tropical medicine from the University of Cambridge. He also deposited in the Anatomy Museum of Trinity College a small collection of human skulls, about 10 in number, of provenance which is generally not clear. He also was introduced to the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, who was enthused by his work. He was so impressed by it, was Sir David Prane, that he encouraged Kerr to keep going and gave him physical assistance to do so. He went back to Thailand after 1908 and set out to explore a botanically completely unknown country. And he did so with expeditions that were large, but also financed through his doctor's pay. He didn't get any money for this, as far as I can make out. He just used some of his salary to finance these expeditions, which were often on foot. And he was a fantastic walker. Jacob suggests that on one trip he walked up to 1,800 kilometers, which is an astonishing journey. He didn't just go on foot. He used ponies to carry materials. He also used boats, such as this one, to navigate the rivers where they were navigable. And he never traveled light. This is him in his tent in the field. It looks, and probably was, actually very comfortable. He's got a couple of seats, a chair, table cushion. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there, which obviously he didn't carry by himself. It was carried for him. He then had the issue of the war. He was a very patriotic man indeed, was A.F.G. Kerr. Whenever the national anthem, God Save the King, at the time, was played, he would stand to attention. Now, that may sound to some of you younger people pretty unusual. When I was at school, we had to stand to attention to the national anthem. It wasn't that unusual, therefore, at the time, but he was very patriotic. And he went to war and he volunteered, and he was given the role of a captain, a medical captain, on the front line in France. But his health wasn't particularly good, and he was invalided out. And I think for at least half, maybe more, of the period of the Great War, he was in the south of France with his family, looking at orchids and making experimental manipulations of them. He returned then to Thailand after the end of the Great War to find that his job had gone. And there's a little bit of a hiatus in his career at this point because he didn't want to go back to work as deputy to somebody who had been newly appointed. But he had got obviously very good connections within the Thai royal family. And this gentleman, Prince Biddyalongkorn, was obviously very supportive of him. Indeed, he was Vice Minister of Commerce and Communication, and he wanted to know what the forests of Thailand had as a resource. So he wanted a government botanist, and he wanted Kerr to do that job because Kerr was very well qualified to do so. And Kerr agreed to do that. He obviously wanted to do it. He agreed to do it, and his salary at the time was somewhere between 125 and 180 pounds equivalent. That's quite a lot of money, I'm told by my Thai colleagues. He started work in September, signing the contract slightly after he started work. His salary was big, and that enabled him to launch even bigger, longer expeditions. So here we can see, I hope you can see, the use of elephants as carrying animals for one of his expeditions. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, great, that makes things a lot easier because, of course, elephants can go through dense jungle, and remember, Thailand's 95% forested, can go through dense jungle quite easily, and they can also protect you from wild animals, attacked by wild animals. Kerr is quite obviously conscious of money because he's spending his money on expeditions, a lot of money on expeditions. And he's more equivocal about elephants. They don't run away like the ponies did, which was a problem for him, but he says that they can only carry as much as 4 men when in fact they cost as much as 5 to use. So he was slightly, perhaps, reluctant to use them. His first expedition went well, except when he got back to Chiang Mai, because he found that his dear wife, Daisy Muriel Kerr, had died a few days before he got back. She died probably of malaria on the 13th of October 1921, aged only 37. He was therefore faced with a huge issue, a number of huge issues, amongst which was the fact that his wife had just 4 months prior to this given birth to their 4th daughter. So he had a very young baby there. He also had his 2 other younger daughters there, in a country where the infrastructure was light, as I've said before, and where obviously his wife had just died. Now, as one of his brothers was visiting at the time, they made a swift decision and they got on a boat to take his family to England, where they were deposited with an aunt who looked after them in Hayes in Kent, Kerr then returning to Thailand. He then resumed his expeditions. And by this time, 1922, there was a train connection between Bangkok and Chiang Mai. It took about 27 hours to do it. Sometimes it didn't always work out well, as you can see from this particular slide. But Kerr did take the train. He also did use cars. There was no roads, but if you're determined, you can take a car many places that are quite unexpected. And if you look at these slides, you'll see that Kerr did just that. They took the car to places that certainly I would hesitate to take a jeep to. So that's his early life. What about his legacy? I'm going to talk, as I say, about herbarium specimens, some of the photographs you've seen, and the diary entries you've seen, and his maps before his later life comes on screen. These are 2 herbarium specimens collected by Kerr. Now, probably, and I'm going to move away from the microphone for a second, you have got no idea what a herbarium specimen is. That's one, and in fact is the one that is in the photograph there. So you're welcome to come and see it. The specimen on the left-hand side of the screen is from a plant growing on the ground. The one on the right, the one that I've brought to you here, is from a tree. Now, the trees in Thailand are quite big. They can be up to maybe 30, 35 meters tall. So the question is, how do you get this material? Well, you can do it in a number of ways. When I'm there, I get somebody to run up the tree for me. Literally, there are tree climbers who will go up trees for you and get the material for you. It's much easier than me trying to do it because I'd fall off, I think. The other thing that you can do is you can use a very long pole to twist bits off the lower canopy, or you can, as Kerr did, use a gun to simply shoot bits out of the canopy and bring them down. Once you've got the material on the ground, you've got to do a number of things to it. Firstly, you've got to flatten it because it's got to be pressed and it's got to be kept dry and it's got to be dried. That is really difficult. Believe me, it is very difficult to do that in a country which is quite often quite wet. You've also got to make good recordings of what you've done, where you've done it, and what the plant looks like, because drying the plant material preserves it, but you lose characters. So you lose color, for example, as a character. The plant on the left, as you can see, the herbaceous plant, the plant growing on the ground, actually is quite brightly colored. That's a photograph I took of the same species growing in Thailand. How many of these did he make? How many collections did he make? Well, he made probably about 25,435 collections. That means he went to collect from 25,435 individuals. But he just didn't collect once from an individual. He collected in duplicate, triplicate, quadruplicate, quintuplicate. So there are probably about 100,000 sheets that he collected. It's an enormous number. They're scattered, held in herbaria throughout Europe, Trinity College, Dublin, as you can see there in that list, but there's also Leiden, that's L, there's Q, which stands for Q, ABD stands for Aberdeen, there's material in Berlin as well. Of this material, at least 1,600 is from species which are new to science. They are so-called type material. Remarkably, he also encouraged his friends to do likewise, and they collected probably about 65,000 sheets. The numbers are big. I'm trying to give you an idea of the scale. This is the interior of the herbarium I used to curate. And that's a cupboard in the herbarium opened for you. That contains something in the region of 1,600 specimens, 1,600 sheets. So you need 100 of those in order to accommodate the collections of Kerr. The volume is enormous. It's just huge. He collected also very widely. There were some provinces where there are no yellow dots. The yellow dots obviously indicate where he collected from. He didn't get everywhere, but he did get most places, which is, again, astonishing considering the infrastructure of the country. What about his photographs and diaries? Well, at the same time as he was collecting all these plants, he was also making lots of photographs, taking lots of photographs. There are at least 3,000 negatives, some unstable because they're on nitrocellulose. There are at least 4,200 black and white prints, and there are a number of pardon me, lantern slides. Again, probably you don't know what a lantern slide is. Forgive me if you do, but if you don't, that's one. It's essentially a predecessor to the sorts of slides that we used to project, the Kodak slides that we used to project. It's glass, it's fragile. He had these in the field. It's also very heavy. So he was an extraordinarily good and able photographer. He was also a phenomenal diarist. There are at least 24 large diaries, 4 smaller ones, and they cover a lot of things. His photographs, as we've seen, are amazing. This is another one of him with a field worker. I'm sorry, I don't know what the field worker's name is. And you might ask, why is he photographing this? Well, he's photographing this because he thinks that he's found a new species, Sapria siamensis. Turned out not to be one, but the enlargement that I show you there is incredibly sharp. This is a remarkably good photograph taken on really in very difficult conditions because the forest there is quite dark. He also has photographs of other objects. This I found in our collection in the herbarium, and I had no idea what it was, except it said scare tiger on it. And then I looked in the diaries, which are held in Q, and I came across this, and it says, and I'll read it to you because I know it's very difficult to read, "Down to the sea we put up a tiger scare, which simply consists of tripod formed of 3 poles, from the top of which is suspended by a rope another pole, which swings loosely in the tripod. Tigers, when they see this, are frightened." Well, you may notice just at the end there of the second, at the start of the second last line, that there's a question mark. So he says, "Tigers, when they see this, are frightened, question mark." So he doesn't believe it. They think it a man with a gun. So he photographed lots of things. He also photographed infrastructure, so to speak. This is Kauphanum Rung, which is a Khmer Age temple. He photographed it as it was then because he was afraid, I think, that it was deteriorating very badly. And he also drew a plan of it, which is accurate because he paced out the measurements of the temple. That temple complex has been recently renovated, 20 years or so it took to do it. And here we've got a photograph of the renovated element that appears in Kerr's photograph. It's also proposed as a World Heritage Site. So Kerr was interested in all sorts of things beyond simply plants. Okay, so let's move on quickly to his maps. This is one of his papers. He didn't publish a lot, but he did publish a paper on an island called Koutau. This is the entry from the diary with, I hope you can see his map, hand-drawn map. This is the drawing that appeared in the paper. And this is the island itself from Google Images. And you can see, I hope, that the map is pretty good, considering that he's on the ground with no aerial view whatsoever of the landscape. So how did he do this? Again, I'm just going to quote from his diary. He says, as an example, at 7:15, our direction south by east. At 7:35, crossed a small stream running west. At 7:53, our direction turned east round a small ravine, then southwards again. By 8:10, south-southeast. At 8:20, our direction was, and you can see he just goes on and on and on and on. So he was continually recording the landscape and the directions of travel as he was collecting enormous numbers of plants and photographing them. To anybody who's actually done field work of any description, it's astonishing. I know, to be honest, of nobody else, perhaps Hooker, who has done the same sort of stuff in the same quantity. It's remarkable. It really genuinely is. He ended up in 1932 being appointed Director General of Agriculture. He was awarded the most exalted order of the White Elephant, 4th class, which sounds perhaps 4th class not so great, but actually it is extremely good. The 1st class is, I think, and I'm happy to be corrected, reserved essentially for the king and for his immediately close family. So 4th class is as high as you're likely to get. He here is shown in a paper as Lord of Ploughing in what you might think is an eccentric dress, but it isn't, because it's still used. This is a current photograph of the same ceremony, which is really very important because it is attended by and actually sometimes participated in by the king. Later life. He was appointed, as I say, in 1932 as Director General of Agriculture. He retired almost immediately. Now, you might think, why did he do that? And indeed, I have wondered about that. I think his health wasn't good, and I think that was one reason. Thailand was also changing at that point quite considerably because the monarchy, which had been absolute until that point, was changing to being constitutional. So it may be that there was some issue there too. I don't know. I don't think there was an issue with the king. Apparently, when the king heard that he was going, said essentially he was very sorry to hear that such a well-qualified foreigner was leaving the country. So he was disappointed to see Kerr go. Kerr ended up with his family, visiting Kew from time to time, but also visiting Trinity College. Here he is shown in our old Botanic Gardens in Ballsbridge. How is he remembered? Well, he's remembered in a number of ways. There's a series of lectures after A.F.G. Kerr, sponsored by the Irish Embassy in Thailand, which obviously are called the A.F.G. Kerr lectures. There are 143 species named after him. This is, I think, the most attractive, but possibly the most inelegantly named. A.F.G. obviously standing for his initials. It's A.F.G. sericea. It's a member of the pea family, and it's really quite lovely, I think. Other people, including this idiot here, have named things after Kerr. In fact, Ima Nikolua, who joined me in this, was a graduate of this college as well. We now turn to the very end of his life and back to Dorset. He died on the 22nd of January 1942 in Hayes in Kent. He died of heart condition, myocardial degeneration. He also had bronchitis and asthma. And he was buried in Cerne Abbas. Now, many of you probably know of Cerne Abbas. Cerne Abbas is well known because of the gigantic chalk figure carved into the hillside above the village. I searched literally for days to try to find an image that I could show you in this, which was not politically incorrect, of this chalk figure. And this is the only one that I could find. And it shows you quite well the scale. That's a whole crowd of school children standing in the club head of the man. The village church is attractive. The Kerr family grave is there, And that's it. And I'm going to read this to you because it's not perhaps cleaned as well as it could be. It says, Arthur Francis George Kerr, eldest son of Elias William and Fanny Kerr, died at Hayes, Kent, January 22nd, 1942, age 65. And I think nicest epitaph that you could imagine that says botanist in Thailand. I think that's really lovely, and I'm sure Kerr would have loved that. Just returning to Jacobs, who gets his date of death wrong, it's the 21st of January 1942, according to Jacobs. So I'd like to thank these people because they provided me with the data which I showed you in the dot map as well as some other information. And I'll close with this slide also from A.F.G. Kerr's slide collection in the herbarium in Trinity College. Thank you very much.